Welcome to Uptown Chats, a podcast where we share stories about environmental justice by and for everyday people. I'm your co-host, Jaron.
And I'm your other co-host, Lonnie.
And today, we have the pleasure of welcoming back one of our very first guests on the show, our very own Annie Carforo, to talk about an important campaign she's been leading called Our Homes Under Our Control. But before we get to that, Lonnie, can you share WEAC's mission?
Absolutely. WEAC's mission is to build healthy communities by ensuring that people of color and or low-income residents participate meaningfully in the creation of sound and fair environmental health and protection policies and practices.
Thank you. Now, before we get to our interview with Annie, I think it's important to acknowledge that March is Women's History Month, first of all. And because of that, we want to recognize some women of color specifically who've played an important role in fighting for housing justice in the United States. Obviously, we're talking about housing justice with Annie in our interview. And so let's set some background, right? Let's talk about some key figures in the movement, right?
Yeah, I was excited when I looked at this because, you know, even as a Black person, there are a lot of people we don't know and we don't recognize as regular as we probably should. And so this was kind of cool to kind of go down this route to see what women of color have been doing when it comes to housing justice.
Absolutely. And sometimes people get past February and they're like, okay, it's Women's History Month. Let's forget all about people of color. Let's forget all about Black history. It's like, well, there are Black women too. Whoa.
Black women are out there.
Whoa. We can celebrate both. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So the first person on our list is someone called Maggie Walker. So for those that don't know Maggie Walker, she was one of the most influential female business leaders in the U.S. in the early 1900s. So in 1903, she founded the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank in Richmond, Virginia, and became the first woman to charter a bank in the U.S. Pretty crazy. I can't even imagine what that's like back in that time.
Yeah, to just charter a bank. First of all, I wouldn't even know where to start.
Yeah. So do I go to another bank? I don't know. Anyway, so St. Luke Penny Savings Bank provided Black people with reasonable price loans so they could purchase homes and establish businesses, which is such an important thing at that time. And Walker's entrepreneurial skills transformed Black businesses and left a really long-standing legacy. And by 1920, that Penny Savings Bank issued more than 600 mortgages to Black families and provided employment for Black people who were, at one point relegated to the labor industry. So kind of opening up both the housing and the labor opportunities for Black folks. And fast forward a few years later, 1924, the Penny Savings Bank expanded outside of Richmond and included more than 50,000 members. And it later consolidated with two other large banks and is still in operation today. So a piece of living history thanks to Maggie Walker and something that has transformed the opportunities for housing for people of color.
Yeah, and Black folks had to build their own, right? We were left out of those markets in traditional kind of white spaces, so we couldn't get just home loans anywhere. We couldn't start businesses, and we didn't have the capital to do so. So people like Maggie Walker saw that as like an opportunity to uplift her folks as well.
Absolutely. Who else do we got? Who else is on our list, Lonnie?
All right, I got Miss Dorothy Height, who was a renowned civil rights and women's rights activist. Dorothy Height dedicated her life to fighting for equality and justice. As the president of the National Council of Negro Women, Height worked tirelessly to address housing discrimination and promote fair housing practices. She was the only woman to serve regularly alongside the quote unquote Big Six, a group of prominent civil rights leaders, although her role was often overlooked due to being a woman, which is why we definitely want to uplift her today.
Yep.
So Height's belief that proactive efforts were key to bringing about change is captured in her powerful statement. She says, "If the time is not ripe, we have to ripen the time," reflecting her unwavering commitment to actively shaping more equitable society.
Yeah, that really hits with me specifically in this conversation where we're talking about housing justice, because so much of what we're dealing with today is the struggles of things that have been left kind of on the table, have been perpetuated over time. Right. So it's not something that we can wait to happen on its own. We need to make it happen. We need to seize the moment and create opportunity for these things to move forward in a way that they've kind of been neglected for a long time, right?
And that's the importance of campaigning and coming together, because campaigns bring together communities who think they may not have the same interest or share the same interest, or are afraid to say that I'm also struggling, or I'm also having this problem or this issue. And it brings them together, and it brings power to a whole group of people to move legislators and decision makers.
Absolutely. So honoring these two incredible women and the work that they've done, that work paved the way for many of the campaigns that we see today, including this campaign, Our Homes Under Our Control, here at We Act. So without further ado, let's jump into our interview with Annie to learn more, right?
Yeah, I'm excited.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Annie. It's been way too long since we had you on the show last time. You were our first official staff guest. And now, a little over a year later, here you are once again to bring us quite a different topic. Last time we were talking about composting, and today we're talking about what?
Talking about our campaign. Annie does so many things, as you see, from composting to this new campaign that we have called Our Homes Under Our Control.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me back. It's about time. So I'm excited to talk about the Our Homes Under Our Control campaign, which came out of the Climate Justice Working Group and is an attempt to think about the affordability pressures that folks are facing in New York on a more holistic scale. So we know that in 70% of New Yorkers are renters. And when you look at what the two largest costs that New Yorkers are incurring on a monthly basis, the first one is rent, shock, and the second one are energy bills. And so We Act, we support housing justice advocacy in the city and state. We support energy justice and climate justice advocacy in the city and state. And so we had these two major priority bills that we were working on at the state level, one being good cause eviction, one being New York heat, and I'll talk a little bit about those later. And so we decided to bring them under one umbrella and talk about them collectively. And so the Our Homes Under Our Control campaign is really focusing on making New York more affordable for renters, for low-income New Yorkers, for pretty much everyday people, because I think all of us can agree housing costs are way too high, energy costs are way too high, and there's systemic reasons for that. And so, our campaign is really bringing these two issues together. We're calling it, a housing and climate justice campaign, and we're talking with our neighbors uptown about the issues of housing affordability, of energy affordability, and kind of what we can do how smart policy can really address these two issues.
We really get a chance to say it, so I'm going to paraphrase you a little bit. The rent is too damn high. It's dated reference, but we got to bring it back. It's
still true.
Exactly.
The rent image is forever burned in my brain. So
yes. And I appreciate some of that background of like how this kind of came about. And you also have a little bit of a background in doing housing advocacy, right? Can you talk a little bit about how, for you, it kind of became a priority? Because, like Lonnie said, you work on a lot of different things, and obviously housing justice fits in so well with so much of the work that we're doing. How did it come up for you as a priority, and like how does that tie into some of your past work?
Yeah. I am a jack of all trades, master of none over here.
Same. That's why we get along so well.
Yeah. So before I joined We Act, I was an organizer in the housing space. I was working with homeless New Yorkers who were, fighting for affordable, quality housing in New York. And so kind of come from that landscape and that background and know and understand how deeply the housing crisis in New York is felt, and the fact that there's been some incredible organizing and we've made some really big advances, but the real estate industry and the real estate lobby is really powerful in New York. And so they've really squeezed a lot of people and made living here a very, very difficult and unaffordable option. And so coming to We Act, the focus is not on housing. We're not a housing organization, and we don't pretend to be. But as our work has progressed, we're thinking a lot about building decarbonization, getting fossil fuels out of buildings. And in order to do that, you have to take a whole home look at a building. You can't just take out the boiler of a building and put in heat pumps and call it a day. You have to think about what are the health and safety issues in that building? How can we remediate the lead? We need to remediate the lead in that building, the mold in that building, before we can then weatherize it, make it more energy efficient, and then we can electrify. So there's all this work that needs to go into buildings before they can decarbonize. And We Act kind of has our hand in all of those separate pots. But what I saw was really missing from the conversation is the fact that so many New Yorkers are already living paycheck to paycheck. So many New Yorkers are already are living in affordable housing. And I'm quoting him, doing bunny ears here, because the housing is naturally affordable because the landlords don't maintain it. And so they don't charge a lot of rent because people are living in really terrible conditions, whether that's with mold or with the roof collapsing, with leaks, whatever it may be, with pests and vermin. And so if there are these mandates at the city and state level that, building owners have to start investing in their buildings, there's going to be a real consequence for the people that live in those buildings. On one hand, they're really good, right? People are going to have better living conditions, but it's also going to justify a landlord that has maybe neglected their building for a long time is now required to make upgrades. What are they going to do? They're going to increase the rent. And that longtime tenant is going to be displaced. And so there's a real risk to the building decarbonization movement of forgetting about tenant protections. And the people that are going to get hurt the most by that are low-income renters. And so we've been really trying at WEAC to bring that into the conversation when we're in these environmental spaces, is thinking about how housing affordability is an issue that we need to be considering in all of the programs that we're talking about and the policies that we're talking about to make sure that we are really protecting our most vulnerable neighbors, the people who are most at risk of displacement, who also deserve and would benefit from these upgrades, from a health perspective. And so that is a little bit of the way that we've been able to bring some of the housing advocacy work into our work at WEACT. And I think it's really nice because there's a really robust housing movement. Housing Justice for All coordinates a statewide coalition that's been fighting for better tenant protections and better living conditions. And so it creates spaces for WEACT to plug into and also bring some of our expertise around healthy homes and healthy housing. And at the same time, we're bringing some of the work that Housing Justice for All is talking about into these building decarbonization spaces and helping people understand the policy choices that need to be made to make this a just transition.
Thank you for that. I feel like I put you on the spot there a little bit, but we had a great conversation about it earlier, and I feel like I wanted to circle back to some of that, all of which you captured really nicely. So thank you for that.
That was captured lovely. And I think one of the things that kind of, as you were talking, I think about how environmental justice is so intersectional, and there's so many different ways that environmental justice can show up in these different policies that people may think are more important or more urgent, like housing and affordability for housing and energy bills and things like that. But there is a connection there for environmental justice. And I think one way that helps simplify that concept is the idea of a campaign and creating a campaign and having something there. So can you talk a little bit about how this particular campaign came about and why you chose to do that now?
Yeah, definitely. So in the Climate Justice Working Group, we oscillate between doing programs and policy work, and our policy work is, heavily focused on the city with LJ, and then it's also, though, has these larger campaigns at the state level, because a lot of the things that we need to win to advance climate justice in the state are made at the state level. So we had been talking a lot about good cause eviction last year, and we had been starting to talk about New York heat. And so going into this year, I knew that in the environmental and climate spaces, New York heat was the main priority bill that a lot of groups were mobilizing around, and that was going to be really the main focus of this legislative session. At the same time, last year we were so close to winning good cause eviction. It was thwarted in the last week of negotiations between the Senate and Assembly and the governor. And so that was, it's unfinished business, right? We still don't have basic tenant protections for almost 1.6 million households in the state. So in the planning going into this year with the Climate Justice Working Group, we were trying to figure out how do we talk about how do we split our time between both of these campaigns, and notice that there is a lot of overlap in some of our talking points. Yes, they're very different, but thinking about, the fact that housing is a human right that's been co-opted as a profit-making commodity for real estate, for landlords, and how our energy system, while heavily regulated, is run by for-profit companies, and how these two industries are squeezing households, tighter and tighter every year. And I think what helped us connect it over the summertime is that it felt like housing costs were at an all-time high. Manhattan actually was breaking records for average rents this summer, and energy costs were at all-time high. Con Edison had just passed, had just been approved for a rate hike that went into effect in August, and then another one that went into effect in January. So there was, both of our bills were addressing different aspects of this affordability crisis. So we were doing a lot of planning with our members. We actually held a retreat and tried to really break down what a campaign would look like that included both of these bills. And, we did some power mapping of our elected officials and where do they stand on these bills. And it was really interesting to see that there were a lot of similarities in terms of talking points and strategy and electoral support or lack thereof. And so we came up with the name collectively with our members, the Our Homes Under Our Control campaign. And we came into January, really testing it out, testing out the messaging, hitting the streets, door knocking, flyering, and trying to bring people into the space to talk about the campaigns and these two bills together. We did our first teach-in in the beginning of February. We didn't have a lot of time for prep for it. With just 2 sessions of flyering and canvassing, we actually brought a decent number of people in, 8 of which were brand new to We Act, which shows, I think, that this messaging is really resonating with folks. We've been able to do a little bit more canvassing and door knocking. We have a decent number of signups. And so we're hoping that, the message is translating into people wanting to get involved. Yeah, so, our members have really been bottom lining a lot of the outreach, a lot of the organizing, and a lot of the policy advocacy. How do we talk about this? What do our talking points look like? What are the top line messages we want communities to understand, legislators to understand? How are we showing up at advocacy days on social media, on call relays, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been really awesome to watch grow. And I think that depending on the outcomes from the state legislative session, we could win New York Heat, we could win Good Cause, we might not win either, knock on wood. I think that we're building a lot of momentum heading into the spring, summer to continue talking to people about this, bring in even more people so that when we head into next legislative session, we're really ready to make a splash.
And you've kind of alluded to this a couple of times, and I'm actually grateful that you ended your sentence there by mentioning those bills again, because a reminder maybe to unpack those a little bit more for folks who are less familiar with the New York Heat and Good Cause eviction. Do you want to just say a couple words about what those respective bills are? Yeah. So New York Heat is a really technical bill in some ways, but also a very simple bill in other ways. It would amend the public service law, which is the law that dictates how our utilities function in the state, to start to wean us off our reliance on gas. There's some really old language in that law that basically incentivizes the use of gas. For example, there's something called the 100-foot rule. I think it's over 100 years old. And it states that if you build a home or you want to hook up to gas and you're within 100 feet of a gas line, the utility will do it for you for free. That's awesome for you, the homeowner or the building owner, because you get connected to gas for free. But it's actually not free. Ratepayers are paying for that to the tune of almost $200 million a year. So the New York Heat wants to change some things like that to stop basically subsidizing the expansion of fossil fuels and gas, and also create spaces to try more large-scale alternatives like geothermal, neighborhood geothermal networks that require cooperation between, hundreds of households. With our existing laws, it's really hard to get that type of cooperation, but New York Heat would actually allow for more of those projects to proceed. It also, and the most important part, and frankly, the reason that We Act is really advocating for this bill, would set a cap on utility costs for households at 6% of household income. So this is super important for if we are talking about a just transition off of fossil fuels. You have to make sure that the lowest income households are not being overburdened by energy costs. And this transition from gas to electric is going to have costs. And so households that right now that are paying over 6% of their income are almost entirely low income. And they could be paying anywhere from 10 to 25% of their monthly income on their utilities. Meanwhile, higher income households are paying 1 to 2% of their income on utilities. And so this cap would basically, it's not cost shifting. It's not making higher income people pay more, but it's codifying in law
that nobody in New York will pay more than 6% of their income on utilities per month. And then it gives the state an array of tools and options of how they want to reach that cap. And there's lots of different ways that they can do that. They can fund more energy affordability programs. They can, fix some of our backwards rate structures. There's a lot of different options on the table. And I think the beauty of this bill is it doesn't require one method, but it would really ensure that everybody can afford their energy bills. That's New York Heat. On the housing side of our campaign, we are actually calling this universal rent stabilization. And essentially, this campaign ask aligns with what Housing Justice for All is calling for.
And that's what you referred to earlier as good cause eviction?
Oh, yeah.
Great. Okay. Just to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah. It is a little bit confusing because I think that good cause eviction is the base of tenant protections. It is so basic. It doesn't make sense that we don't have it. And so I think there was some angst in the housing movement to be asking for more. And so good cause eviction is part of this idea of universal rent stabilization, right? It is basic tenant protections to all unregulated housing in New York State. So in New York City specific, not New York State, but in New York City, about nearly half of our rental market are rent stabilized, which means if your building is built before 1974, it's more than 6 units, you're likely rent stabilized. And you have limits. You have right to a lease renewal. So as long as you don't break your lease, as long as you pay your rent, you get a lease renewal at the end of the year. So you can stay in your apartment for as long as you want. And your rent is only allowed to increase at percentages set by an outside body called the Rent Guidelines Board, which is majority appointed by the mayor. Under Bill de Blasio, rent-stabilized apartments saw 0 to 1% increases every year. Under Eric Adams, we're seeing 3 to 5% increases every year. It says something about their priorities. But, it is still a much more stable method of renting housing. You have a sense of what your rent increases are going to be, so you can plan for it. And you also know that you are going to be able to stay in your apartment as long as you are a good tenant. There have been issues with rent stabilization. There's been lots of loopholes that landlords have really used to weaken it. And so in 2019, there was a really big push to tighten the rent stabilization laws, which passed and was, a huge momentous win from the housing movement. And now they want to go further. They want to expand the eligibility of buildings that are eligible under rent stabilization. They want to bring it to other parts of the state and make it easier for other cities to opt into rent stabilization. So there's a lot of really exciting stuff cooking in the housing justice movement to be bolder and bigger with our vision. But that kind of starts with passing good cause eviction this year, which would support the, like I said, 1.6 million households in New York State that are renting and have no protections. So what that means is that your landlord could decide halfway through your lease that they don't want you to live there next year, and they can just not renew your lease, and there's nothing you can do. They own the building. You have to get out at the end of the year. So good cause eviction would guarantee the right to a lease renewal as long as, again, you are a good tenant, you don't break your lease, and you pay your rent. And it would also limit rent increases. It would require a landlord to go to a judge to justify a rent increase that's over 3% or I think the consumer price index, whichever is higher, I believe. Again, it stabilizes a little bit of those variables that unregulated renters are forced to face. And I think a lot of people can relate to this more than they realize. There were lots of headlines, when people were getting COVID deals on apartments and they were getting really discounted rents. And then as the market started coming back and people started coming back to New York, people were seeing $800, $1,500 rent increases on their next lease renewals because those landlords said, hey, I can make a lot more money. The housing market is really hot right now. And that's super destabilizing because people moved into homes and now we're forced to leave because a rent increase of $800 for a lot of people is an eviction. It kind of levels the playing field between landlord and renter, and it gives renters a more clear idea of what to expect. And that if they are a good renter, if they are a good tenant and they're not breaking the law, they can stay in their apartment, which is, huge. So that's kind of been the fight this year is to pass good cause. And it's been a fight for the last 5 years. But I think a lot of people are recognizing that this is really basic and really necessary. So, there's hope that it passes.
One thing about the good cause that I want to clarify, and maybe you can let everyone know, is this a new thing in the country that exists, good cause eviction, or is it already exist in other places?
It is, basic tenant protections that most cities that have a large population of renters will, have in place. New Jersey, our neighbors, have had good cause eviction in place since 1974. So this, everyone wants to talk crap about New Jersey, but in policy world, they're doing some things a little bit better than us.
See me in Hoboken. So much of what you said, though, about both the New York heat and good cause eviction, it resonates with me that so much of what we need as, residents, as people living in a place, living in the city, is reliability and predictability, like both in terms of our heating and our rent. It's so hard to deal with the volatility that comes with living in a place that has such a transient population, people constantly moving, and also so many people kind of influxing, like you said, after, in the years after the pandemic. And putting in place things like this where you have predictability makes it more livable for folks who are on a low or fixed income, and folks that are at risk of other things kind of destabilizing that kind of balance, that careful balance that they've crafted and being able to meet their needs, right?
Absolutely.
And those with lower income as well, a lot of people forget that they don't have the luxury of mobility the same way as other people do. So moving or being kicked out or being evicted is a huge strain, because you may not have anywhere to go. You may be leaving a community or support system that you've been in, that you grew up in for so long, and you don't have that anymore. You have to figure out where to go. It may have to be outside the city. It may have to be, miles from your job, and you don't have reliable transportation to get to and from, and childcare. Like there's so many, there's a ripple effect when it comes to kind of evicting someone.
100%. And people have a misconception about homelessness in this city, but the largest population that are experiencing homelessness right now are families with children. So, there is a real crisis happening where we are not supporting people in general. And that impacts folks who have the least financial, flexibility and freedom, because you're right. Like if you get if you're told you have to leave your apartment in 3 months or you get evicted, you might not have the money for the broker's fee, the moving costs, Where are you going to find an affordable apartment right now in the market? They don't exist, right? So there's, it's a lot of factors that play in. One thing I want to mention also, though, that ties, I think, good cause to some of our environmental work is people are living in homes that have pests, mold, deferred maintenance, landlords that have neglected their building for years, decades. And if you wanted to try and hold your landlord accountable and tell them that you have this mold issue and you need to fix it, and you report it to the city, and you really advocate for yourself. If your landlord finds out that you're doing this and you're an unregulated tenant, retaliatory eviction could happen immediately. They could evict you at the end of your lease and tell you, like, you got to go. I don't want you in my building. If you have basic tenant protections like good cause, organizing your building or advocating for better living conditions is not a good cause of, that's not a reason to get evicted. And so you would actually be protected in that situation, and you would have more power to talk to your neighbors and to really hold landlords accountable for the way that they maintain their buildings in a way with protections that, you wouldn't have right now. And so that feels also really important to me and to our work, because we get comments all the time from people about, like, how can I fight this? Like, this is insane, the way that, this mold that's in my bathroom. And there is a risk to, like, putting yourself out there and really fighting for yourself. And that is something that you should not be retaliated against.
Yeah, I appreciate you kind of tying it back in neatly to the work that we do, and to some of the work that, myself, with our Healthy Homes Working Group, advocate for a lot. So I think we're nearing the end of our time. So I want to circle back to this last question and give some opportunities for folks to see ways to plug into this work. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of the next steps for this campaign and how folks might get involved over the next few months with Our Homes Under Our Control?
The state budget is set to come out April 1st. And the way that the state works, we put a lot of legislation in our budget. So we are hoping that Good Cause makes it in the budget. We're hoping that New York Heat makes it in the budget. So we'll know after April 1st, we'll get a better sense of, like, how we did this year and what we won and what we, still have to work on next year. And through the Climate Justice Working Group, we're going to plan a number of eat and learn, dinner and teach-ins. We're hoping to have one a month, up into the summertime, for people to come meet some of the organizers, meet some of the members, chat about these issues over food because everyone loves food, and have, more casual and informal spaces to, meet your neighbors, but also join this advocacy work and this advocacy campaign. And so keep an eye out for those dates coming up around Northern Manhattan. And, also join the Climate Justice Working Group because this is what we talk about, every month. We have a lot of city stuff coming up, but we are always trying to really elevate the policy and the campaign work because that we know is, has, major implications and effects on people's lives. So yeah, join the Climate Justice Working Group and come meet us at a dinner teach-in event.
Cool. We'll make sure to include information in the show notes for how to join that. Lonnie and Annie both help run the Climate Justice Working Group. So
to be fair, Annie just tells me what to do and I do it. So that's how that relationship works. And it works well.
Yes, we've got a very strong representation from the Climate Justice Working Group though. But yeah, well, thank you so much, Annie. I feel like I have so much rattling around in my brain of all the things to just process, even though we literally just talked about this earlier today. I feel like there's still so much. You've reminded me that there's so many pieces of this puzzle of figuring out our housing situation and making it affordable, making it healthy, making it something that we can sustain over time and that meets our needs.
And I think even if I was someone who wasn't working in this space, coming somewhere and saying that there's this campaign called Our Homes Under Our Control takes all of that chaoticness of like what's going on in the housing and it puts it together to make something that I feel like I can fight for and I can work with other people, my neighbors and my other community. Because I think one thing that's really important when we kind of have these teach-ins is seeing, there are other people who care about this. There are other people who are suffering. There are people who don't want to pay more than what they need to be paying for their electric bill. There are some people who don't know whether they're stabilized or not, but they want to keep their home. So I feel like it's such a universal thing that I think it's important to see that we all do care about these same issues. So we should come together for change.
Yeah.
Thanks, Annie.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you like the episode, make sure to rate and review the show on whatever platform you listen on. If you have thoughts about the show, we encourage you to reach out to us with your thoughts and suggestions at podcast@weact.org.
And make sure to check out We Act on Facebook at We Act for EJ. That's WEACTFOREJ. Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at We Act for EJ. That's WEACT4EJ. And check out our website, weact.org, for more information about environmental justice.
Until next time, let's raise the roof on housing justice. Okay, I tried.